Tonight, we're going to talk about getting ready for spring. And someone suggested doing this program in February. And I said, well, it takes 3 months to get ready. And they said, okay, we'll do it in January. And I've got to bring it up. So this is where I lived when I started keeping bees. This is I was standing on the roof of the house looking out over the small barn next to the big barn. The shadow across the roof is the big barn that's right beside it.
Hey, BJ, we're not seeing anything.
You're not seeing it? Thanks for telling me. I didn't.
Pretty mental image, though.
There we go. How about now?
No, I'm not sharing your screen.
My assistant is helping me.
Do it from the beginning.
Okay. How about now?
Now we can see it.
Good.
Yeah, it's good.
The shadow across that little barn, that was the calf barn, and we put a couple cows in there and put about 8 calves on them to have their dinner and breakfast. But that's looking out across, and that's that ridge is about 3 or 4 miles away. It was a nice little camera shot. That was an ice storm about, I don't even remember what year for sure. I guess about 12 years ago or so. It was like 12 degrees, and that's Dad's beehives. Dad started keeping bees in the late 90s after me taking care of them earlier. This is a photo from Spalding County, right down near exit 201 south of Atlanta on I-75. Crimson clover in the springtime. Notice anything strange about those hives? You might see brood chamber super, brood chamber super. We were making splits that day and setting them all up, and then that evening when all the bees are home, we moved them and stuck a new queen in her cage in the hives at the new location.
What kind of clover is that?
Crimson. It has a spike with just thousands of blooms per spike, and they gradually bloom from the bottom to the top. Making package bees with my buddy Billy.
Are those perennial?
The bees?
No, the clover.
They pretty much have to replant in October. And it kind of idles along through the winter and then takes off. You can plant them up here. Probably want to plant the end of September up here. Grocery stores, Weeks Works, selling honey. That's what I look like when I'm harvesting honey. I squint a little bit and keep my mouth pretty well closed. You can see the piles of bees. But that picture is Fannin County in the summertime. Now we're going to get into the important stuff. Evaluating and anticipating. These are two words that usually don't get their full due relating to keeping bees. So, Trina. Can you guys see the words on there okay?
Mm-hmm.
We
On
can.
mine, the pictures are covering up the top row. Trina! Excuse me. She's got her earbuds in doing something. She can't tell them. I either need my notes on the side or I need to get rid of the pictures. One of those two things.
You can minimize the pictures of the participants if you need.
There you go. Okay. We can deal with that. And they aren't seeing the top bar anyway. So that's that.
You're good with that?
Yeah, that's good enough. Evaluating involves seeing and understanding what's in front of you. That sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? But it's not really quite that simple. Evaluating questions the cause and the effects of the cause. Evaluating anticipates the result with all of the variations. That's a mouthful. Evaluating allows us to make a plan that will be the most productive in a timely manner. You notice every word is chosen for these little statements. Evaluating deals with the past, the present, and anticipates the future. And many of you have heard me say that for some reason in beekeeping, the evaluation stops with the present. And so that means that when you're in the hive, you're doing what should have been done 2 weeks previous. You've got to evaluate into the future in order to be a good beekeeper. Evaluating sees a variety. It sees all the possibilities of what can take place for the future. It recognizes the patterns and the reasons for the variations in the patterns. So a lot of times people will say, I don't have a clue why this happened, but I sure was glad it happened that way. And the next year it might be, I don't know what went wrong. You've got to recognize the patterns. If you keep a journal, it will help you a whole lot. Anticipating is expecting what is going to happen next and being prepared to act on the needs before the optimum opportunity passes. Problem is, every hive is different. And if any of you, and I know Ryan has had as many as 10 or 14 hives, but when you're doing numerous hives, a lot of times you have to get through 2 or 3 before you get a routine of what you need to be doing or what you need to be making adjustments for in the hive. With 2 hives, you're finished before you realize and start thinking about what's going to change in the next 2 weeks in the future. January, which is right now, you want to evaluate food quantity, volume of bees, where the food is around the hive. You want to do emergency feeding if necessary. If the hive has a lot of food, just this a small jar on top of the cluster will give them food in their stomachs to keep a higher activity level. And when they cluster up real tight from a larger cluster, it will allow them to keep some food right next to the cluster. In that picture, it's 12 degrees. That's back in Dad's hives up there in Iowa. Bees are in the top brood chamber. Problem with putting a jar in is you have to have storage for the frames. Now you notice you don't have to take out 9 or 10 frames in order to put a jar in. You can do it just fine by removing 2 or 3 just to fit the jar and have it in the position you want it to be. Small clusters need a higher activity level. The reason is it takes a lot longer during the day after a cold night to allow a smaller or medium-sized cluster to break out and start relocating food sources and get active. Inside the hive, the air temperature is cold, and that box holds that cold in, and a smaller cluster without the high activity level just can't break out until later in the day. The result of that is they can't get their stomach filled up with food that's outside the cluster. They can't relocate food. Pollen patties to help get a higher activity level, to help the brood survival in the cold weather where they aren't flying enough. And another thing you can do if you have a real small cluster, if you have 8 frames of honey, you have basically ice packs in there that are going to keep it extra cold a lot longer than it needs to be. So if you remove excess honey from a hive that doesn't need it and take empty frames from the hive that could use more honey, you can benefit both hives. The idea is 1 frame of honey on each side of a cluster, and then you've got your frame or 2 with brood right in the middle. If you've got 3 frames of brood and 6 frames of bees, you really don't need to be removing excess honey. You just have it placed in the right place to benefit the hive. Too many supers. above the excluder, bees are moving up. Ryan breaks this law, and he won't mind me telling you this, but he likes to store all of his equipment on the hives. And so in the wintertime, you might see 2 or 3 supers on most of his hives. And that's Ryan's method. If all 3 of those supers had a little bit of honey in each one, the bees would be so spread out, they wouldn't have the size cluster that they could have if they were either empty, so they wouldn't attract the bees up there, or removed. It's nice in January to keep the hive as tight and compact as possible, and that will benefit the cluster and building up a brood volume. Moving a super of honey below the brood chamber with an excluder separating the super from the brood will put food underneath the cluster and help that bottom of the cluster not to get into kind of a starvation mode after cold nights. We were in 45 hives down in Cairo this morning, and we had one of them that had a pile of dead bees in the bottom of the hive. And when I saw it, I said, the entrance is plugged up. And sure enough, that's the bee. There were enough dead bees in the bottom. They'd plugged the entrance, and that causes the bees to kind of go hyper, and more bees die. Why that happened? Evidently, they just didn't have the ability to get food from the jar of syrup on top for the cluster. And when they clustered tighter on the cold nights, they were separated from their food. They still had viable brood. They still had bees. They still had food in there, but the frame with the most brood right in the middle was absolutely dry. Evaluate and watch for mouse activity in the hives. Reduce your entrances. You can put 1/4 inch, 3/8 hardware cloth across the front. There are little hive reducers, entrance reducers, mouse guards that you can purchase and have. Reducing the entrance because you're feeding helps to keep robbing from taking place. Stack your dead outs. If you get a dead hive and they have a mass of bees between some of the frames, if you clean some of those dead bees out so air can circulate, the dead bees are going to, as they decay, they're going to produce fluids, but they're going to cause a lot of molding in there, and that will damage the comb to where it could be difficult for the bees to repair, rejuvenate, and reuse. If you stack your dead outs, if you want to leave them out in the bee yard, put an excluder underneath them at the entrance. Stack your supers, brood chambers on top of the excluder. That way they get air through them, and you protect them from the rain, the weather, the mice. Stacking your dead outs too is, it's like you're owning up to the loss, and you get past the depression of having the hive die, and it's like it's taken care of, and you've accepted the fact that it's dead. You don't have to look at it and say, oh yeah, that's the dead one, and be depressed the next time you go out. You've got to anticipate all of the above and prevent as much as possible. You've got to anticipate the spring and the summer needs at this time. And this is just January. February, you got to feed to protect the brood quality. In other words, where is the food located? Is it just in the box above the brood frames and maybe a frame on the edge of the cluster, or do all the frames have a little bit of food on them? When the bees are in nectar flow, everybody has food in their stomach. Between the bees going out and foraging and sharing it and relocating it for the other bees to process and dry it out, everybody gets their stomach filled. When there's no nectar coming in, or it's too cold for the bees to fly and find nectar, they have to depend on the stores. And when the stores are too far away from the cluster, your bees are going to be borderline or complete starvation. Be critical of brood quality. Now you have to evaluate and ask, is it the lack of food? Is it a bad queen? Is it disease? Is it mites? And it's not always easy to break down the cause. Manipulate frames to maximize brood volume. When you get up to 3 and 4 frames of brood, but you've got 6 frames of bees, they can handle another frame of drawn comb in the center. And so spreading them and putting one frame in, and maybe 2 weeks later, they might be ready for another one, and so on and so on and so on. But right now, most of your hives are going to have a high volume of bees compared to the amount of brood that you have. You don't want to expand them too soon, because if you expand them too much or too soon, you are busting the cluster up into 2 clusters, and one of them will be queenless, and they would probably raise a queen, supersede your queen, and that's very damaging to the hive, as well as just losing brood volume, because 2 small clusters are much less effective at warming the hive than one larger one. Boost weak situations to test queen viability. And you really want a hive that is growing good to keep growing and not take away from them too soon. If you try to take away from a hive before it has 5 frames of brood, you're going to slow it down a little. Once you get to 5 frames of brood, you've pretty much reached an unstoppable situation. And so in January and February, you're just adding a few bees is usually more beneficial than even adding brood. Keeping food in the right spot, like we kind of talked about a minute ago. But manipulating and giving enough bees into that hive to keep that queen warm. And then when you're starting to get out to where you're bursting at the seams, then you can share your brood. Double your brood. Reverse brood frames timing. Typically in Cherokee County area, not so much up in Fannin, by the end of February, you're at a point where if you had a brood chamber on the bottom that had food in it, is now empty. And your brood in the top brood chamber is probably up to 6-7 frames of brood, and you've got some food. If you've got a super on top, they've been moving the food out of that top brood chamber through the excluder into the super. And so at this point, at the end of February, you've got enough bees that if you take the empty brood chamber with drawn comb off the bottom board and move it into the middle position under the excluder, but above the brood chamber with the brood, you've got enough population that will fill it about half full of the cluster size. And that means that if you feed them and they reorganize their cluster, they're already in that box, and you'll probably have eggs in it within a few days. Too much food in the top brood chamber. You could add a second brood chamber with drawn comb on top to allow them to expand upwards. See what the next, okay. Sometimes I had to pause and just wonder if the next line is going to bring up what I want to tell you. If you have a cluster at the end of February and it's got 2 frames of brood, but the whole box is full of bees, you have a situation that they don't have enough space for their brood, and they can't eat the food fast enough to make it. And in that situation, it would be beneficial to put a second box on top, either a super to allow them to move food upwards, or a second brood chamber with drawn comb preferably. And I would be considering the option of putting a drawn frame in the middle of the 2 frames of brood in the bottom, and taking 2 frames of honey and not putting them together, but putting them maybe in the third position from each edge with empty drawn frames in the center, which would encourage them to reorganize their cluster to include those frames up above. And it would give them the opportunity to have 3 frames of brood in the bottom very quickly. So optimum situation for double brood with brood on the bottom, a minimum of 5+ frames of brood, high surplus of bees and food. Less than optimum, place empty brood chamber underneath the existing brood chamber so that it's there when you're ready for it. They'll take care of it. And if they really have to expand, they'll expand downwards. You're up to 5+ frames of brood. You've got to anticipate rapid growth, high food consumption. Feeding motivates expansion. Don't overfeed. Anticipate the need for medications. Take care of it in the early stages. Hopefully these probiotics will help us as far as avoiding European foul brood and these little things that are more of an annoyance than a death to the bees. March, brood volume, need for food, need for supers. More bees starve in March than any other time. That's not saying more hives die in March, because now with our mites and medication that doesn't do as good as we want it to, and all those related problems, it seems like there's more hive loss in October, November time than there is in March. But this type of death is when you have a hive that's just solid pattern brood on 7 and 8 frames, and they starve to death, and you've got 2 gallons of dead bees and all those frames of dead brood. If there's a possibility that some of that brood is still viable, your best thing to do is to shake out the dead bees and stack that on top of another hive that's strong, and get bees in there that will clean up the dead brood or allow it to hatch and add to their hive. This is part of just kind of minimizing your losses and maximizing your strengths. But the bees can do a lot to help you be more successful. You've got to anticipate queen needs and replacements and splits. Anticipate the effective timing of the splits. Splitting too soon destroys the momentum. Splitting too late, and the balance between growth and honey production is less than optimum. If you make a split and you have 3 frames of brood and bees, it's going to take them several weeks to get up to a point where they are a strong, productive hive. If you take the time to grow your hive from January, February, and March, you can split and have 2 hives that in 10 days, 2 weeks, they are reorganized and they're going strong on new brood. You've got a new queen introduced that you've purchased, and both hives are capable of producing a volume of honey for you. You've got to anticipate the conflicts of foundation and hive dynamic. Foundation is a barrier. Excluder is a barrier if you've got foundation above it. Brood frames with foundation, they will draw foundation on brood frames a lot better in March than they will in April. And the reason for this is in April, you have nectar flow, you have a high volume of brood, and the bees are actually evacuating the brood in order to keep air circulating and keep it from getting too hot. So once they do that, you don't have the density inside the brood cluster to draw foundation. At that point, your high density of bees is above the cluster. So early in March, all through the month of March, you can draw an occasional brood frame with foundation in the middle of the cluster and put a jar of syrup on after you put that frame in, and you come back a week later and it's drawn and you have eggs in it. If you don't have any drawn comb in your supers, you may want to remove your excluder and allow your bees to go up and start drawing comb and then put your super back in. But this is usually end of March and into April. Woodstock, a lot of times you'll have honey production the last week of March. North end of the county and Cherokee County and up in Pickens County, it's pretty rare to have actual accumulation of honey and nectar in the hive in March. I'm going to minimize this or drop it down, and we're going to get your faces back up here and see if you have any questions. So I know that's a lot of information, and I've just fed it to you pretty fast. What questions do you have?
I have a question, BJ.
Sure.
Shannon. So I have one colony that's still doing well. When I was in there a couple weeks ago, it's a double brood chamber, and the top 8 frames were covered in bees. So my question is, I'm planning on going back in there this Saturday when it's going to be about 60. Can I break the 2 boxes apart to examine everything, or is that not a good idea?
When you're up at 60, there's no problem. They're kind of sluggish to react to smoke. You have to just stand there and smoke and smoke and smoke and smoke in order to get them to do anything. If you really want to prevent them flying up at you and coming out of the hive, a spray bottle with a little bit of sugar water in it, thin it down. You don't want any more than 1-to-1, and less than 1-to-1 is fine. That will spray that on the top bars, will keep them occupied this time of the year. I won't say they'll give you a hug and a kiss for doing it, but you might not want them to give you a kiss either.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Can we print your presentation?
Yeah, it'll actually be on the website soon too. I would ask that you don't use it to present a program. Somehow it would probably lose a whole lot of the effect.
Oh, it's just for our personal use.
Yeah. Is that Wes? Who's asking?
Is Jim
Stratton.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, that's no problem. I've got to go through this and rewrite it into a 12-month what to look for in your evaluation format. And it's just one of those things that I've wanted to do for a year and haven't gotten done. So hopefully we'll get something like that worked up. Some of you know I hate telling people what to do. I want to equip them to be able to ask and answer questions on their own so that they learn to make decisions in their hives. And so if I help you, give you clues on how to evaluate, I'm not really telling you what to do. I'm just helping you know how to get there. So I know it's frustrating, and I know it's a lot harder than me just telling you what to do, but in the long run, it's many times more beneficial.
BJ, I have a question.
Sure.
Back to the January slide, when you talked about stacking your dead outs. I'm assuming you're just talking about the boxes, right? You've got your frames stored somewhere where the moths can't get to them.
My frames are always in the boxes.
Even if it's a dead out?
Especially if it's a dead out. I would never try to store frames that have dead brood in them outside of the box that they're supposed to be in. If they're dying in August and September, maybe even up to the middle of October, if you store them outside, you're going to get wax moth activity. Mm-hmm. Usually by the middle of October, we're having freezing temperatures and pretty good frosts. And unless you already have moth activity, it's not going to start after that period.
Okay, so one of the hives that I lost, I have frames that have nectar or sugar water probably from where I was feeding. So you're saying, are you saying that I could leave those frames outside in the box? Just leave them with the top on and they'll be fine? I shouldn't have to worry about moths or critters or anything?
When did they die?
Like November?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, because I have them all tucked away in my dining room, taking up space, occupying dining room floor space.
You
So
are
you're
many
saying-
times more likely to have moths in the heated environment of your house than you are outside where it's cold.
Okay.
So if and most likely there are some stage of wax moth larvae present in your hives, they will grow much faster inside your house, even inside your garage, than they will outside where it's not sunny or, where it's cold.
Okay.
If you're going to move them away from their normal position, store them in a place that doesn't get warm in the daytime. Out of the weather somewhat, but a shaded area or an open shed where they can stay cold. Starting right now, the sun, you've noticed, I'm sure, that the temperature at 56, 57 degrees, if you're in the shade, you wear your coat. If you're standing in the sun, you can take your long sleeve shirt off. And that has that same effect on the bees. Bee hives that are empty of warming them up and allowing those wax moths to develop in the processes. Again, if you leave them out there, put an excluder on the bottom board so that you can't get any mice going up in them. If you've never had mice get in a brood chamber, they will destroy the frames. They can destroy the wax foundation. And of course, they've already destroyed a large area of wax, and they will carry a lot of trash in there, build a nest, and have babies. And they can do it beside a small cluster without having any conflict until that cluster starts growing and has a higher activity level in the spring. Any other questions?
I got a question, BJ. It's Jason.
Okay. Go ahead, Jason.
I guess the question should be, would this be a good time? I mean, when it warms back up, because I see next week we're going to be up in the 60s again. And, I mean, would it be an okay time to treat with oxalic acid again? Or...
You're asking the wrong person. I'm not an oxalic acid person.
I know.
February, if you're going to treat, you really need to start treating by the third week in February, because any treatment for mites is going to take 3 to 4 weeks. If you want to treat with something that does not, that works best when you have no brood or small amount of brood, there are several things along that line. Right now, that would be fine to use that. You have to be careful using anything that will disperse or spread out the cluster that the bees will draw back from right now, because you want your cluster to be as cohesive as you can get it, and you don't want to slow the cluster down. So
Okay.
I know people are doing oxalic this time of the year, and you just have to try to get up to a point where they have good strength. I would say you probably want to have, 3.5, 4 frames of brood before you start doing the oxalic, unless you see that you have a lot of problem already. But to do a late winter treatment is a great idea, because you have the opportunity to get those mites just as low as possible before nectar flow starts. I appreciate that question. I should have had something in there in the February. Well, we did have the word mites, didn't we?
BJ, you mentioned you're not an oxalic acid guy. Are you more of an Apivar guy?
I use a lot of Apiguard in August. And some
No, Apivar strips.
I do. I tend to use Apivar strips in the wintertime more. It has no effects as far as breaking up the cluster or repulsing the bees. It is chemical. It has very short life, and so you don't get a residual in the wax as much or with the bees. Very unlikely that they would ever develop resistance to it because of the short life of the chemical. Did that answer your question, Jason?
It did. Sorry, I couldn't get to the unmute button. But yeah.
Okay.
Um,
So what are you going to do now?
Well, I guess I'm gonna. Well, when it warms up, I'll tear into the colony and see what I see. I mean, to be honest, I hadn't looked at it in several weeks.
Yeah.
I just peeked through the top yesterday or the day before.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, there's bees moving in there, so that's a positive.
Reports
But,
I've had is that vaporization with oxalic tends to slow down the brood for a week or two. And that's why I think if you were to get up to, close to that unstoppable momentum of, at 3.5 frames of brood now, you would probably have 6 frames of bees. And when you have that kind of momentum, if I were going to treat them with oxalic, I would not put an empty frame in the middle until the next week. I would keep them real compact to do it. And then when you come back the next week, put an empty frame in the middle to try and get them up to the 4th frame of brood or 5th frame of brood.
I have another question. I know it's pinning down an answer from you is like hen's teeth. It's really hard. And I know it's a lot of variables, but what am I looking for temperature wise? Consistently. I know we're going to hit the 60s this week, but then it's supposed to be back down highs of 40s next week. So
How many hives do you have, Jason?
Right now, I've got one.
Okay.
They've all died except for one. I've lost 18 hives.
I was thinking you probably had several. If you had 16 hives right now, I would start out, if it were me, say it was 55 degrees in the morning, I would start out with the weakest hives or the ones that I had a note that there was a problem of some kind and I wanted to check on them. The reason is they're going to have less defensiveness and they're going to have the smaller populations, and it's warm enough that you're not going to hurt anything. And at the same time, you can get them out of the way while the other bees aren't flying. There's no danger of causing a robbing problem in the weak hives as you might if you do them last. My rule of thumb for February in mid-Georgia is if it's 45 degrees and I'm comfortable outside in a heavy denim shirt with a t-shirt, the sun's shining, I'm in the sun. If I'm in the strong hives and they fly, they can get back to the hive. If I go in a weak hive or a hive that's starving, I can't do that because if they fall out, they can't get back in the hive. So I'm giving you 2 different approaches as far as which ones I would look at when and what would be the problem that would stop you from looking in your hive at a certain temperature. Understand in February, if I were doing it at 45 degrees, my goal is to get to as many hives as I can before it gets dark. And here I am at 8 o'clock in the morning thinking about what time it's going to get dark and how much I can get done before dark gets here. Jason knows I don't stop to eat for lunch. He was with me once many, many years ago, and I sent him to get lunch while I kept working. I was trying to take care of him and his son.
But
BJ, all you had when I was working with you was Sweet Thins.
There you go. I don't even eat them anymore. Too much gluten. They
I have a quick question.
and understand when I say February in Butts County, that's 100 miles south. You're at least 2 weeks later up here, so you would be somewhere in the second week of March.
okay.
Shannon, you were going to ask something?
Yeah, something real quick. I stopped my testing for mites. When can we start that up again?
The best way to do it right now is to powder sugar the top bars and pull the sticky board out an hour later. It doesn't even have to be a sticky board with a 1 hour wait time. The mites will get clogged up in the powdered sugar and they'll still be there.
Okay, I'll do that.
It's a very good way to lower your mites just a little bit, increase the activity level of the bees. They become very hygienic for the next hour or so. If you really want to lower mites, you're going to need to do it about once an hour, for several days. But it's not very feasible for most of us to powder sugar our hives every hour.
Thank you.
Denver Pendley died maybe 12 years ago, and Denver lived down Powder Springs Road, Marietta. He was probably 78, 80 years old at the time, maybe 82, and he called me in the third week of March telling me he had mites and wanted to know what to do. And I was in a little bit of a dilemma. Well, you don't want to use chemicals. Powder Springs Road in Marietta, you got nectar flow the last week of March. And so I said, Denver, do you have screen bottoms? No, they're solid bottoms. And you've got them up on stands, so they're 18 inches, 24 inches off the ground. Oh yeah, they're up off the ground. And I said, well, Denver, if you will powder sugar them just 3 or 4 times a day, as much as possible, and do it every day that it isn't raining for 4, 5, 6 days, I'm sure it will lower the mites for you. He called me back about 3 days later and he says everything has changed. They're flying, they're active, they're acting healthy. They just weren't acting healthy at all before. And that's what the powder sugar does for the cluster this time of year. Anybody else with questions?
Yeah, how do you do the powdered sugar again?
There's a lot of different ways you can do it. You can shake bees into a jar and have powdered sugar in the jar. You can do like those of us at work, if you're working and you leave at 7 o'clock in the morning, you get home at 6 o'clock at night, it's kind of dark both ends of the day, right? In that case, I would just put a sticky board underneath and leave it for 24 hours. And of course, being underneath the screen bottom, you don't need to mess with the hive, the cluster to put it in or take it out. And that will give you an idea without using powdered sugar. What I said to Shannon was when you're out in the bees, if you powder sugar it with a board underneath, it doesn't have to be sticky because you're going to pull it an hour later. And just powder sugar, heavy sifting, like a flour sifter or a shaker bottle. If it's a hive that's covering 6 frames, you might want to use 1/4 to 1/3 cup of powdered sugar. And an hour later, you can pull the sheet and see what you have for a mite activity.
Thank you.
Right now, most of your clusters are going to be on the top half of a few brood frames. If you've got a really strong hive, they may have 2 frames with brood going all the way to the bottom. But even with a high volume of bees, they may be just in the top half of the frame. Well, what if you go in your hive in 2 weeks and all of the brood is at the front edge of the hive, but they've got 5 frames of brood? What are you going to do? Anybody want to take a guess of how they would deal with that situation?
Add an empty frame.
Okay.
Spin it around so they're in the back and make them draw out towards the front.
Thank you, Jason. You don't have full frames of brood. So if you add another empty frame in the middle, you'll get another half a frame of brood. What if you take 2 of those frames? If the half of the frame that doesn't have brood is sealed honey, you drag your hive tool across it to break the caps. You don't dig into the comb at all, and you're dragging so that you're not gouging, you're just dragging across to break the caps. It almost looks like you haven't done anything at all. And you spin 2 of those around so that you have brood alternating at the front, the rear, the front, the rear, the front. The only thing you have to watch is that you keep the pollen frame that's set up for the edge of the cluster, keep that at the edge facing the brood. So once in a while, if you're going to change that frame, you have to reverse it from this edge of the cluster to the other edge and trade them back and forth. Basically, you're giving them a message. They want the cluster to be the size out as far as the brood goes. So you have just changed it from being a cluster that's 6-inch diameter to being a cluster that is 16-inch diameter. If they don't have the volume of bees, you do it with 1 frame. And then the next time you're in, when they have expanded their brood, you do it with another. This is working with them to help them to be better than they would be on their own. You're their coach. A coach can look and see the strengths, see the weaknesses, the limitations, and make things better. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we're going to close it down. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks for having